Right. Thank you for your patience. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Transform Finance Investor Network webinar, where we'll cover a case study in Steward Ownership, looking at the conversion of the Organically Grown Company. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. And today I'll be joined by Aner Ben-Ami of Candide Group, Derek Razo of Purpose, and Natalie Reitman-White of Organically Grown Company to look at the why of Steward Ownership, how it works, and then digging concretely into the model. Glad that we could have this session today, and we'll get right into the content. First, a very quick update on our end. As some of you know, we are currently hiring. We have a couple of open positions, but in particular, we're looking for a manager for our research and advisory services. So if you are on this webinar, chances are you care about some of the topics that we care about. So you might know somebody that would be a good fit for us. And I would encourage you to send them our way. It's a very exciting position. Now, turning to today's topic, just to contextualize the presentation today, we have looked at alternative ownership. We spoke the last time about the SOCAP track that we put together for SOCAP 18, where we had several panels, including a presentation with on the Organically Grown Company transaction. But you also probably saw the webinar with the World Fair Trade Organization on using business structures as a form of fair trade. So baking into the business structure some of the salient elements of fair trade, going well beyond the certification aspect. We covered platform co-ops, and we have spent a fair bit of time on employee ownership. Now, this is actually a bit of a first for us. It's the second time that we have Purpose with us, and it's because this stuff is just so exciting and frankly is quite complex. The first one was more of an introduction to what the concept of steward ownership was, its origins, its kind of philosophical underpinnings. And we had a presentation, you might remember, from the co-founder of Kickstarter on their considerations about how a conversion to a purpose trust or to steward ownership could have facilitated an exit with the preservation of the mission. So with that, we can just turn it over to our presenters. They've spent a lot of time thinking and actually doing for once on this. Thank you all for joining us. And Aner, I will turn it over to you now to get us kicked off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. So I will just kind of set the stage a little bit, and we'll hand it over to Derek and Natalie to drive most of the content here. We worked alongside Derek and his team at Purpose to lead this investment, and wanted to just kind of offer some initial thoughts around, or framing around, the why, right? Why do we even need to? We'll run through these slides, and there are a lot of complexities around governance, around structure, around the financing, and kind of wanted to make sure we keep in mind sort of why we got into this mess, right? Why innovate at all, and even within kind of doing the world of innovative or unconventional structures, Andrea already just kind of listed a few others that we've touched on on other webinars and in our work, right? Co-ops and platform co-ops and ESOPs. And so, why couldn't we just kind of pick one of those too, right? So something to kind of keep in mind as we talk through this. So I think to kind of frame broadly the challenge I think we were facing in sort of a multi-dimensional puzzle, and various stakeholders with various challenges to try and address. So one, primarily, first and foremost, kind of the company side, right? So a company like OGC or companies like OGC, what are they looking for? So they struggle to find a structure that will allow them to remain independent, will allow them to remain independent over the long term, not have to think about an exit or liquidity for investors, and have that kind of drive their trajectory. They need a structure that allows them to be kind of mission first, right? To put mission ahead of other considerations. And if you think about a company like OGC, you'll see there's also kind of this multiple stakeholders, right? There's a company that has farmers at the table, customers at the table. So how do you do this in the context of a diverse kind of multi-stakeholder environment? And then a particular challenge for a lot of these companies that are nearing the succession stage, right? So more mature businesses, who see some of these in the organic food movement, kind of the early pioneers of the organic food movement, as they think about long-term where they go if it's not into the hands of a private equity fund or a strategic acquirer. And then for these other stakeholders, workers, suppliers, farmers, communities, I think the challenge we're trying to address here is thinking through how are they capturing their fair value, right? So if a company does, we always like to frame it as, if the company does really well, are they getting their fair share? Are they also capturing some of the value creation? Are they creating wealth, or is that going out to other parties, to investors, right? And then from an investor perspective, you'll hear us we'll circle back towards the end of this to talk through kind of the specifics of how we thought about this as investors. But if we're investors supporting this multi-stakeholder, mission first, independently structured company, like, where do we fit in, right? So if we're not participating in governance, if we're not in at least not in the traditional way, or not in the standard way that investors hold kind of governance control, and if we don't participate in upside, or we're not in the same way as we traditionally would, and we're not angling towards an exit in the way that we traditionally would, what does an investor look like? How does an investor fit into this? And is debt the only path, right? Because that is almost kind of the definition of an investor that doesn't participate in governance and control and doesn't participate in upside, is a lender, right? But as you can imagine, debt alone can't provide all the capital that's needed for these companies. So that's kind of this kind of multi-dimensional puzzle we're trying to solve here. And find something that simultaneously is workable and for all these stakeholders, for the company, for its various stakeholders, and for investors. So just to kind of put that general framing in our collective minds, and then I'll hand it over to Derek and Natalie to talk through the specifics of OGC, and kind of then back to me to talk through some of the specific investment terms. So I think it's handed over to Derek now. I'll mute myself here.
Perfect. Thanks, Anair. Yeah, I really appreciate that high-level framing. Hi, everybody. I'm Derek, co-founder, partner at Purpose Ventures, and I'm just going to. I'm not able to move the slides, I don't think. Oh, here we go. I'm just going to give a really quick overview of steward ownership, what we mean when we talk about steward ownership, and then we're going to kind of move into the case of OGC and talk about it really, really practically, both from the governance perspective and from the transaction. So at Purpose, our mission is to help companies stay mission-driven and independent for the long term. And we've done a bunch of work to try to understand how have companies solved these problems that Anair was just kind of explicating previous. How have they solved them in the last 50 to 100 years, both historically and new companies that we're still finding every day? So, what the question of what is steward ownership is, it's kind of a term that we have made up to encapsulate a series of governance principles that I'll go through, which we didn't invent, but we sort of learned from the community of entrepreneurs who we have been working with and researching and investing in over the last 3 years. And what we found is that companies and entrepreneurs that want to keep their company mission-driven and independent need to do this by instilling certain principles in the legal DNA of the company. So steward ownership is, it says here, is a proven alternative that permanently secures the company's mission and independence in its legal DNA. So practically, what does that mean? Here we go. So steward ownership means that a company commits itself to 3 principles in its charter, its articles of association, or in the way that if it's multiple entities, the entities are structured. So firstly, we talk about profits serve purpose. So what this means is that beyond covering costs of capital, the excess profits of a company are either reinvested in the company, shared with the stakeholders, or donated to charity. So the company is no longer a sort of private wealth generating machine. The founders have been either paid back or a part of some kind of long-term profit sharing scheme. And the company is actually free to put its capital towards its mission. Most steward-owned companies reinvest much higher than the analogs in their sector. And many of them also, especially larger ones, donate quite a lot of money to community purposes and stuff like that. Second principle is that independence is permanent, and we sometimes say it's self-governance. So the company is governed by people who are connected to its mission and connected to its operations. So this means that the people who are involved in the company are making the most important decisions about how to reinvest, about how to spend profits, about how to do all of these things. But it is not that control of the company is not for sale. So we sort of live in this almost market of corporate governance control, as one of our advisors, Colin Mayer, talks about. But in this case, we're sort of taking the control of the company off the market. And so that kind of leads us to the third principle, which is that economic and voting rights are separated. So this is achieved in a whole bunch of different ways, but we want investors to be able to participate in the success of a company, but the bringing of capital to a company to allow it to grow and flourish and create more value in the world is not inextricably tied to voting rights, as in the sort of normal transaction that we might be more used to seeing. And so this sets up a really unique incentive structure, and what we see when we've interviewed hundreds of workers and more than that of people who've participated in these companies. And what we find is that these people feel intrinsically motivated. They feel really strongly connected to the mission. And we see a whole range of steward ownership structures from, worker co-ops with a poison pill all the way to executive-driven sort of industrial foundations to multi-stakeholder trusts like we're going to talk about today. But the ultimate aim of all these principles is that, the long-term success of a business, its employees, and society are all integrated into the legal DNA of the company, and it's a legal commitment that is not reversible. So keep going here. Some examples of companies that you might know about, and one that we've worked on is shown here. So Organic Valley, really large organic company, is a co-op, but also has long-term mission protection baked into its sort of liquidation preferences to sort of disincentivize people from selling the co-op, disincentivize the members of the co-op. Mozilla is a U.S. foundation-owned company. They're 100% owned by a nonprofit, but they are a corporation, and they have shareholders, and there's a whole bunch of complexities around that particular structure in the U.S. Ecosia is a technology company that we've been working with, who we converted to steward ownership. That is the largest sort of social search engine. They don't track you when you search, and every time you search, they plant a tree to reforest areas in Africa. So if you haven't tried it out, I highly recommend it. Another example of a fully foundation-owned company in the U.S. is Newman's Own. So they famously donate 100% of profits to charity. So not all of these companies look like nonprofits owning corporations, although that is one structure that that is somewhat common in the U.S. But this is just to give you a little bit of a flavor for that there are many real companies who you're sort of used to seeing or touching in your everyday life that have already adopted some of these structures. Next. So just to give a quick overview of why companies choose this path and what the research about these types of companies said. A lot of these numbers come from research on the industrial foundations, which is a form of steward ownership, which is really common across Europe, but because of tax laws, it's not as common in the U.S. And we see a whole laundry list of benefits for the company. Mission and values preservation is obviously at the top of the list. Long-term orientation, we've heard from a lot of the CEOs of some of the largest steward-owned companies that the structure has allowed them to reinvest much more aggressively and patiently than their competitors. Steward-owned companies are kind of forced to create governance mechanisms that are stable and that allow them to make hard decisions. So to have entrepreneurship, but also to be accountable to the people who are being managed or who are the stakeholders of that community. We hear from employees that we interview about these companies lots and lots of good things about their connection to the company, and that's why we see statistics on employee productivity and retention are much higher. Same with customers, and we've seen over time that we have a roughly 100-year history of steward-owned companies to look at, and we see that many of these companies, some of the classic historical ones being Bosch and Zeiss and large industrial manufacturers, have lived through multiple political regimes, financial crises, etc. So they're much more resilient in the face of external shocks. On the left, you can see here is a curve from our booklet, which I can share the link to, which shows that steward-owned companies are about 6 times more likely to survive over the course of a 40-year term. This is taken statistics from the Danish stock market, of which 70% of the companies are steward-owned. So just a little bit on the benefit, the sort of impact benefits, the stakeholder benefits of steward ownership. For workers, we see more stable companies. Workers who are more connected to their mission have a more enjoyable time being a part of that company. Almost always, a steward-owned company has some inclusion in governance for workers, whether or not that's full one worker, one vote, or councils of workers who need to be involved in decision-making processes that affect them. We routinely see higher wages for workers in steward-owned companies, and there are a lot of ways to include workers in the success of a company, whether it's profit sharing, which is a sort of best practice among steward-owned companies, or distributing some kind of non-voting stock, kind of like an ESOP. For investors, we ourselves are investors. We have 2 investment vehicles, and we're really kind of putting our money where our mouth is here, and we see this partially as a risk mitigation tool. These companies have, because of all of the benefits that we've kind of just gone over, we think these are sort of categorically a less risky type of investment to be making. We get to sort of solve this problem of participation with other stakeholders in a manner of good faith and knowing that we're all on the same page and incentives are aligned. We feel that these are going to be more profitable long-term holdings for us. We have an evergreen vehicle which it did the investment that we're talking about today. And one of the other benefits for investors is that we've got clear pathways to liquidity. So rather than kind of betting on when the exit is going to happen and what percentage we're going to have of that exit, usually we have a much more structured return that we can kind of count on and plan around. And so finally, for communities, I think the benefit's really simple. It's, jobs and wealth are staying where the company is. The companies don't have the same incentive to leave, to privatize the wealth or to shelter the wealth, etc. Oftentimes, as you'll see in the case of OGC, broader communities than just the workers or the management are included somehow in the governance. And especially with the larger steward-owned companies, we see that excess profits often get donated to local initiatives in the spirit of taking care of the place where you where you are. When people control their the businesses that affect them and that are in their space, they want to give back. So those are some of the stakeholder benefits. And now I'm going to pass it on to Natalie to start talking us through the OGC case study.
Hear me? Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Reitman-White with Organically Grown. I've worked with OGC for 13 years, and I led, on behalf of our board of directors, I was on the board for 9 years, this project to restructure the company into a perpetual purpose trust ownership structure. So just a little bit of background and context on who we are as a company. Primarily, we're an infrastructure company. We're providing the backbone within the sustainable and organic food trade, moving millions of pounds of products every year. So we're a fresh fruit and vegetable company. We've been around for 40 years. We are a 24/7 operation. We've got warehouses and trucks throughout the Pacific Northwest. And every day we are providing the infrastructure that's needed to get farmers product to market, to help them take their products that are off grade and move them into different channels, as well as help customers throughout the Northwest have a full line of organic produce year round. We're problem solving in the background to make that happen, working with our network of growers and our network of logistics providers. Let me move the slides here. Do I have control?
Use the little left sidebar to go down.
Okay. Okay. So let me just describe our ownership journey that brought us to this new structure. So first, I'd like to start with why the company exists, why we were formed, and then how our mission and what we've done as a company has evolved over time, and then how we've modified our ownership structure to better support our next phases of growth and evolution of the company itself. So why do we exist? We were formed 40 years ago by the community in Eugene, Oregon, that wanted to bring healthier food to the community. They were concerned about processed food. They were concerned about conventional farming's effects on public health and the environment, and they wanted to have more access to healthy food in our community. Very quickly, and so it was a nonprofit formed by the community. And a few years into the nonprofit, the group realized that the best way to get more healthy organic food in our community was to form an agricultural marketing co-op that could be a distributorship for farmers. And the rationale was that in order to get more healthy food out there, we actually have to help farmers make a living growing that food and help them coordinate production so that they can understand what is needed in terms of demand in the marketplace, and then coordinate who grows what crops, and share a truck, share a sales force, share a facility to aggregate and get that product to market. So we went from a for-profit, or from a nonprofit to a for-profit, the goal of which was to help the farmers be economically successful, bringing more product to the market. Grew and grew and grew as an ag marketing cooperative that was owned 100% by the farmers. And now the demand for organic had really grown. We had national standards were starting to emerge. We had worked hard on forming Oregon TILT so that we could trade across state lines, certified product. We were heading towards national standards. And so there was wide acceptance in the marketplace from not just natural food stores, but other grocers to start sourcing organic food. And our farmers had limited supply. So they had what the Northwest season can provide. So we started wholesaling product from outside of our region to sell year-round demand. It worked well for our for our workforce, because rather than shutting down and slowing down in the winter months where all we had was potatoes and storage onions and parsnips, instead we could sell year-round produce. So we'd keep the trucks full, keep the facilities full, keep things moving year-round. And it also worked well for our farmers, because as we know, farming is volatile, and now they own a full wholesale distributorship to be able to put their product first to market when they have it, but also aggregate with others. That became a conflict with co-op laws, because we were wholesaling now more than 50% of the product that we were distributing was not from our farmer members. It was from California, Mexico, and beyond. And so we had a strategic choice to make: stay a farmer cooperative or transition into a new form that would better serve our mission and operations. So we transitioned into an S Corp, and the founding farmers, their co-op shares became S Corp shares. At that time, we also had an ethos at OGC that our workers were putting in their creativity, their labor. They were part of growing this market for organic and the success of the enterprise. So they should also be owners too. So at that time, the group voted to allow employees to buy into the ownership. Grew and grew and grew, and we had well over 200 employees, and we realized that the S Corp had a limit of 100 owners, and we had this painful process where we'd have to let in a few new owners every year, and a bunch wouldn't get in, and it was kind of heartbreaking. So we thought we need a more progressive structure to allow additional employees to become owners. So we added on an employee stock ownership plan. And that was in 2008. And the benefit of the employee stock ownership plan was also being formed in 78. We had farmers and employees who were some of the original founders and who had bought in, who were looking for liquidity. They were looking for a way to create liquidity so that they could retire as they stopped farming and stopped working for the company. So the employee stock ownership plan became this nice way for the company to buy back stock and give it to employees as a part of compensation. Continued on that path, and we realized that the employee stock ownership plan was going to be the future trajectory for the company. We found that once we added on the employee stock ownership plan, we started to have to use fair market valuation, go with the federal rules of ERISA around managing these retirement plans. And because of the tax benefits, the trajectory with the ESOP is to go towards 100% ESOP over time. And I was on the board of directors at the time and said, is this really the structure that's going to serve our continued mission and into perpetuity, that'll allow us to continue to operate OGC for what we're here for, which is to be a vehicle for moving produce by paying the farmers the best prices we can, by paying our employees the best wages and benefits, by offering the best services to our accounts, and by all the policy and advocacy work we do in the landscape to keep organic growing, keep standards strong, and keep evolving to best practices. And our concern was that the employee stock ownership plan might not be the right vehicle for allowing us the future for growth of the company, because, and I'll get into that in a bit, but we essentially self-fund that plan in order to stay independent, which can constrain cash needs, as well as we have this broader mission that's beyond just providing a great retirement plan for employees. We have this broader mission about really reinvesting in the farmers, in the infrastructure, in the advocacy work. And when it becomes just the employee focus, will that kind of pull us away from our mission? So we launched this project to look at alternative structures. And this is the framework that we used for evaluating structures for ownership. And I think no matter what your structure, I think these are key elements to evaluate any structure on. First, does your structure support why you exist and what you're here to do? Is it reflective of that? Second, does it support your principles around your values and culture, how you want to treat each other, who you want to reward, who you want to make decisions in your company, and really reinforce that culture that you want to have on an everyday basis? So those are both what I call the heart of who you are, why you exist, how you want to treat each other. Then we go to the head, which is strategy. Does your ownership structure actually support your competitive game plan in the marketplace as a business to continue to offer products and services that are going to keep you successful and viable? And then also, does it support your cash management needs, right? What does your company need? You have this great mission, but do you have the cash flow and the cash management to support reinvesting in that mission and keeping the company viable? So we were looking for a structure that would fit all of these, and we evaluated moving towards 100% ESOP against this. And let me talk about some of the challenges. One of the challenges for us is we want to maintain independence. We want those who are active in the business, controlling the business and making decisions. We feel like that self-determination by the people who are involved in moving the product every day and growing the product every day keeps us successful as a business and keeps us true to our mission, and then ultimately keeps us competitive in the marketplace. So in order to stay independent, we were self-funding the liquidity from our founders and giving that to employees as compensation. And that can really, depending on how much is being retired at what time, what the value is, can pull away from your ability to use cash for other purposes. Additionally, and if you can imagine, say we have 10% turnover in a year, you're buying back 10% of the stock every year once you're a 100% ESOP, which can be challenging. The other issue that we found was that, stock ownership is not necessarily something that everyone wants. And we were giving it to them saying, you all want to be owners, here's stock. Someday when you're 65 you leave the company, it'll be worth something. But given the diversity of our workforce, we have people who are, in their early 20s, this is their first warehousing job, all the way through people who are nearing retirement. And so what we found was not everybody wants stock. Some people want more cash in their pockets today to do what they need to do today. And some people do want to plan for retirement. So there's this diversity issue. The other thing that it can create is the haves and have-nots in terms of when people came into the plan and when they leave the plan and how much stock was retired. So it can actually be very variable that you happen to be there during years where there was a large buyback, so you get large allocations, but it's not necessarily tied to your performance and motivating today and rewarding today for the work that you're doing today. It's more an issue of chance and circumstance of entrance and exit into the plan. And it can tend to reward employees who were there first. Another challenge that we found was with the organic marketplace having so much consolidation and so much acquisition going on, there can be a lot of fair market value fluctuation, and we felt like we were being pulled around by what was happening in the marketplace of companies that were for sale, maybe through strategic acquisition, because there are a lot of conventional companies buying up organic companies because their conventional lines are not growing as fast, and this is the trend. And so that can really pull you around. And I'd say also, we've been approached for years by people in the community saying, we love what OGC does, we'd love to invest in OGC. And the S-Corp ESOP structure had only one class of common stock. You can't issue multiple classes of stock. And so we, in 40 years, have never accepted outside investment. We have always self-funded the company through our own profitability, and we were hesitant to issue the same kind of control stock to outside investors that might pull away from our self-determination of the people who work with us. Finally, probably the most insane thing that we found out about our past structure was that, as I mentioned, we're not interested in being for sale, but the fiduciary duties of employee stock ownership plans, given the federal rules, trustees have to entertain unsolicited acquisition offers and consider their fiduciary responsibilities to maximize the value of the plan assets. So meaning they have to maximize the share value for the retirement of employees today. So they can't think about the mission of the company or future employees' ability to participate in this, the income generation of the company. They have to think about, if they get an offer, whether that offer is so attractive that it's best for the employee's retirement today, and entertain the offer to sell the company, which 8 to 10% of ESOPs unwind every year because of attractive acquisition offers, as well as the inability to fund stock buybacks. So those were real challenges that we were experiencing 10 years into our plan, and we were looking for some alternatives. So the alternative that we landed on, working with a great legal team from Stoll Reeves, we looked at a variety of structures against those four principles, and we landed on a unique use of U.S. trust law to create a purpose trust that would acquire our company stock, to hold it into perpetuity, never to sell the company, and the trust itself as the majority owner never to extract a profit or sell the shares. So let me just kind of paint a picture of what a perpetual purpose trust is. So it's not a charitable trust. We fulfill our mission by being a for-profit company, providing a living to the workers, a living to the farmers, and viable products. So it's a trust that allows us to do non-charitable activities, real business activities. And the trust, as an owner, is established for the benefit of a purpose, not a person. So traditionally in a family trust, the family members would be people who are direct beneficiaries over time of the assets in the trust. In this case, the purpose is the sole beneficiary of the trust that has been established. So the proceeds and assets held in the trust can only be used to the purpose. The other key feature of perpetual purpose trusts is that they do not end with the death of a settlor or grantor. They may operate indefinitely. And they can have a lot of flexibility around what the purpose is defined as. So in our case, we've established this trust to hold Organically Grown Company as a vehicle for continuing to deliver on our mission, which is to promote health through organic agriculture as a leading sustainable organization. So what that means is the stock will be held in the Purpose Trust, and the owner, the trust, will direct the board of directors to operate the company into perpetuity to fulfill our mission, being a distributor of organic produce as that vehicle into perpetuity. So it eliminates the need to have ongoing energy spent on continuing to create liquidity, because we're putting into the trust and then we're done with the changing hands of liquidity and needing to continually find an appropriate mission-aligned owner. We've selected our owner, and that owner will hold it as a steward into perpetuity. And so what that allows us to do then is to take the income of the company and reinvest that income into the people that work with us in our supply chain, as well as to pay back investors, as well as just continuing to invest in the operations of the company. So here's the nuts and bolts of what our structure looks like. So here's the ownership. So the trust holds 100% of the common stock with no exit, and is the steward owner. And then we have the ability to have preferred shareholders in a non-voting stock at the company level, which is the company's a C Corp benefit corp in Oregon. Here are the financial flows. So essentially, as Organically Grown Company, the distributor makes money, The trust needs a minimal budget to administer the trust, but all it does is hold the stock, and it never extracts a profit and never wants to sell the stock. So not much income flow has to go to the trust. And basically, we can take our income and primarily reinvest it in the company and share it with our stakeholders. And then we have an arrangement with preferred shareholders to have a base dividend and then a share of the profit sharing amongst our 5 stakeholder groups, investors being one, employees, farmers, community allies, and customers being the others. And in there, we'll talk through more of the mechanics. This is how governance works. So in our model, since the trust holds all of the control shares, they have the ability to appoint the board and make sure that the company is being run to mission. Who runs the trust? You can structure it so that your founders are your trust protector committee, and they can simply reappoint their successors. In our case, we wanted the accountability through to our stakeholder community. So we have a qualifying process for employees, farmers, customers, community allies, investors, those 5 stakeholder groups, to qualify to nominate and elect our trust protector committee, which holds the ownership shares and ensures the company is run well over time. So for us, the trust solves a number of problems. We take the company out of a position from ever being forced to sell, because the trust has no interest in selling the company, and in fact is mandated not to sell the company. And nobody could have the direct benefit if the company was ever sold. So you eliminate that impetus. We've reduced the risks and challenges associated with kind of that S-Corp ESOP structure, in the sense that we no longer have to do valuations. We no longer have to continue to deal with all the administration of the fiduciary duties with that. And then we can simply share rewards as we go. And I think this is really key for us. We want it to be real time with the people who are working with us today, to be motivated to put their product through us, to work for us, to buy from us. And so we can simply reinvest the income as we go, rather than pulling the income out to liquidate shareholders and kind of pay for the past. We're continually sharing as we go. So how do we finance getting into this new structure? This is what our financing looked like before. So essentially, the S-Corp and employee stock ownership plan held Organically Grown Company. We used our profits to create liquidity. Employees were given stock as compensation, and shares were recycled. In the new model, we have a lot more resiliency. So the financing to get from where we were to where we are now, we took on a loan to allow us to buy back stock and put the stock into the trust. And eventually, over time, the trust will own 100%. Now, we've issued a non-voting preferred stock, which is reinvesting in the company that will buy down the rest of the minority stock and until the trust acquires 100% of the company. And the preferred stock is available as a private placement to accredited investors, as well as we have some of our employees and farmers and other stakeholders can reinvest through that preferred vehicle for those who do want stock ownership, and for but it's not required. So some can take their profit sharing and do something more real time today, and some can come back in this vehicle of long-term stock holding if they want. This is what the structure looks like post-conversion. So after we pay down the debt and all of the stock is in the trust, it's a very simple operating model moving forward. The trust holds the shares, and as we generate income, we share the rewards with our stakeholders and with our investors on balance. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Anair, who will go into the details of what this green bubble looks like in terms of investor participation in this model.
Yeah, actually, before I jump in, there's I see there's at least one question that came in through the chat that maybe we can address now, and then if maybe pause for a second if there's other questions just to kind of hit now, if that's okay with you, Andrea. Yeah. So I see the question that came in was that whether did employees buy in initially via the restricted stock purchase? So maybe
Yes.
that's one that you could.
So in the outside of the ESOP, employees purchased shares from other stockholders. So they purchased shares from farmers. And there was another question about how profits are shared, and I think Nair will.
Yeah, I'll get into that one, and in terms of how what the split is, which has been kind of predetermined. Although interesting to note, I think there are still questions which Natalie could speak to around how not the relative amounts or the relative weights that each of the stakeholder groups get, which we have predetermined, but there are going to be some questions around how they get distributed to the various stakeholder groups. So how do farmers or do the growers just get cash distributions? Do they get preferred terms? That will still be determined, I think, over time. And there's a question around how long do we expect it to take until the trust has full ownership? Maybe you can touch that one, Natalie.
So right now the trust is in a majority position, and as we raise the preferred stock, we will pay out the remaining common stock to get it into the trust. So we're anticipating this to happen over the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a question about how our employees and farmers reacted to this change. So we had, in our collaborative spirit, a series of dozens and dozens of meetings with our coworkers, with our grower owners, and overall they understood that OGC is a vehicle for transforming food and agriculture through the work that we do every day, and they have an interest in sustaining OGC as that vehicle so that they can continue to put their product through it and continue to work doing work. And the fact that the company wouldn't lose control, I think that was a huge thing for people. Maintaining our independence and our own self-determination is really important to the people that work for us and the people that do business with us. I think they've seen what has happened to other companies in our sector that have sold to larger conventional parent companies, and how structurally it changes how they operate over time, how they treat their suppliers, how they treat their workers. When you don't have the people close to the operations making the decisions, and the people who treat each other every day and live in the company every day, collectively making the decisions, and you have kind of far away, distant folks where things look good on paper and they set certain expectations that are unrealistic for the reality of how you run the business every day. I think people have seen the pain points of that when their friends have worked for companies that have sold. And so they were very interested in us maintaining our independence and self-determination, and also our ability to have financial resilience over time. So we got 100% approval of our transition from our stockholders.
And I think there's two sort of related questions here around the Perpetual Purpose Trust. One was that how common it is and what prospects there are for it to spread and what barriers there are for it to spread. And the other is, because it's not very common and it's a new form, are there any concerns that once it does get more well known that there will be more regulation? I know we have at least one or a couple of lawyers on the call that could chime in on that one, but I don't know if Natalie, do you want to chime in terms of kind of your research on that question?
Yeah, well, we worked with a good legal team. I think that purpose trusts have been in existence for some time. They have been utilized for usually more private purposes, like putting money aside to maintain something into perpetuity after your death. So like an art collection that you've established that will never be sold, to be maintained and displayed to the public regularly. To utilize purpose trusts for holding company stock is a new emerging idea, and it's not just OGC who has done it. A number of companies have done this instead of employee stock ownership plans, they've done what are called EOTs, employee ownership trusts, using purpose trust statute, where it's a more simple structure where employees are the simply sharing the profits each year as they go versus holding stock. So I think it's a new flexible instrument, and I think if anything, we can improve regulation to potentially make it more attractive, like employee stock ownership plans are, in terms of tax advantages for founders putting their companies into trusts. And we've had uptake already in the state of Oregon and elsewhere for changing state law to make these forms more accessible, because I think others realize that this is a real complement to social enterprise and making sure that companies don't leave the locations and where they're operating and stay independent and contributing to their communities.
And Derek, do you want to maybe comment about that one too? Because you guys have done a lot of research on kind of the different legal structures, and there's also maybe the last question we'll hit now around the what's a way to do this in this case in Latin America or Mexico. I know you guys have done a lot of work in Europe and have done some work around advocacy as well and kind of new legal forms. So maybe your perspective there.
Yeah, so a couple different perspectives. I mean, first I would just echo what Natalie has already said. I think we would actually welcome more attention. I mean, we're part of the task of what we need to do is sort of steward that attention so that people can see how powerful this type of model can be for social enterprise and for local economies, I think in general, state level economies and beyond. So I think we would welcome regulation, and in terms of other models, I think that the perpetual purpose trust is one way of instituting steward ownership, and Natalie has kind of taken us through how the governance looks and how the investment. Well, we're also about to go a little bit more through how the investment side of it looks, but I guess I would just add that we have done a bunch of legal research as well as practical investments in the U.S., and there are a number of different forms that steward ownership can take. I would say that the three most popular or common forms of steward ownership. The first is sort of what we like to call sort of the B Corp Plus. It's a steward-owned B Corp. So basically protects the mission in the B Corp charter. The charter for that was written with us by Rick Alexander, the general counsel for B Lab. So we're really, really confident in the sort of integrity of that form, and that looks a lot more like a sort of traditional corporation with multiple share classes, and some of them have economic rights and some of them have voting rights, and it's sort of like a cheap and clean way to achieve a steward ownership form. Perpetual purpose trust is obviously the second one, and as Natalie said, we've seen there's a sort of handful of companies that have done this, and I think that we're in the process of working, Natalie and OGC with the Oregon government, and I think we're gonna ramp up some of that work to include regulators and more lawyers in the process of stewarding that conversation in the right way. And then the third form is, I touched on it very briefly earlier in the call, but is the sort of nonprofit whole ownership of the corporation, and we tend to hear not so good things about that particular form. So most of the steward-owned companies that we have worked with are either this perpetual purpose trust or the golden share model. which is the sort of B Corp Plus. You asked a question about Mexico / Latin America. Yeah, I mean, I think we actually have given a $100,000 grant to Sistema B in I think in Mexico. I wasn't managing it, but we're close with them and trying to help spur the movement on there as well. So maybe you can reach out personally and we can connect over that. I think the must-haves are a legal form that can issue different classes of shares.
So I'll mention one other thing on the regulation front. Part of why the rules exist the way they do around employee stock ownership plans is you're promising employees a security and something for their retirement, right? So it's a securities issuance, it's stock, so it has to be managed in a way that you want to make sure that there's good management of that asset, fair valuation, and so forth. I think in this case, since you're keeping the equation very simple, you're simply sharing in the income as you go by reinvesting it in the businesses and reinvesting it in your stakeholders via profit sharing for employees. Actually, Anir was mentioning earlier what we plan to do with farmers is continued investment in our grower services. So for example, we do things like we provide discounts on boxes that farmers use to package their products. We provide discounts on the certifications that or we help pay for the certifications that they need to access the marketplace. Those are in kind, those are happening as business operating expenses. And so I don't see the government having a need to regulate those things as the same way as an employee stock retirement plan, where they want to make sure that you're not, leaving somebody with a security that is not managed well and not worth what they expect it to be worth for their retirement over time. In this sense, it's pay as we go, and people can do with their proceeds what they want. And certainly, from a tax standpoint, they do get taxed as income, or so that the government does have access to that tax revenue. It's just in a different form.
Okay. Well, we'll keep going here, and as Natalie said, kind of getting into that green bubble on this page in terms of what it means what does the preferred equity structure look like, and what does it mean to be kind of a preferred equity investor in this context. So maybe I should start with Natalie mentioned that the first closing, the first transaction that placed more than 50% of the ownership of the common stock into the trust was funded by using senior secured debt from RSF. So naturally, I mean, if you're a company in looking for what OGC is looking, which is retaining control, right? The first thing you should go out and do, the first thing you should go out and look for is debt, and not give away equity, not give away your control, right? But there are caps, there are limits on what a lender can do, right? In terms of debt service coverage and collateral coverage, and they were able to fund essentially about 50% of the full transaction using the RSF loan. And so the balance, they went out to market and said, all right, well, we'll structure this as a preferred equity investment. Now, again, our challenge was to make that preferred equity investment, feel a bit more like equity, right? Because initially, if we're looking at an investment where investors are, sort of have no voting rights, have no control, and then are getting some sort of preferred dividend, then at some point it starts to feel a lot like subordinated debt, right? There's a senior lender, RSF, we're sort of next in line, so we're subordinated, and we get some sort of fixed return, and so there is this question around, well, what makes this equity, or should we just call it should we just call it subordinated debt, or should we try to make this more, behave and feel more like equity? And so, at a high level, kind of this high level framing here that we took was, on this slide, if you kind of start from the left hand side, this is the conventional kind of standard shareholder primacy approach, where the investors are the owners and everyone else is sort of on the outside, right? The workers, the suppliers, the customers, and we're all just kind of trying to maximize profits and returns to shareholders. And then moving to the right, or the center of this slide, the alternative that we've seen and we've participated in several times on behalf of our clients are the employee ownership structure, the employee ownership movement. So co-ops, companies like Organic Valley that was mentioned here earlier, or Equal Exchange, or Namaste Solar, maybe some of you are familiar with. We participated in those offerings. In some of those offerings, they go out and they offer, again, non-voting preferred shares, where essentially those shares act a lot like very deeply subordinated debt, right? That there is sort of a fixed return to investors, and really no control, no governance, and no participation in any upside if the company does well. And so that's kind of the illustration or graphic here in the middle would be that in that model, the workers are the owners. They're on the inside, and then essentially investors are on the outside, along with the other stakeholders, suppliers, customers, other stakeholders. We're essentially external capital providers. And what we were kind of aiming for here is this multi-stakeholder model. This illustration on the right-hand side of the slide, which is that there's a trust, and the trust is accountable to all the stakeholders. All the stakeholders have a voice in the trust and have a role in governance and nominating the group that oversees the trust. And then all of the stakeholders do have some economic participation in the upside of the company, right? So we're trying to find this, hence this kind of Goldilocks analogy. We're trying to find this middle ground between on the one end of the spectrum, shareholders are on the inside, everybody else on the outside. On the other end of the spectrum, workers are on the inside, everybody else is on the outside. And how do we create this model where investors are just one of several stakeholder groups and participate alongside those other stakeholder groups?
And in there, I might add, while they all of our stakeholders participate in the upside, no one stakeholder could economically benefit from selling the control of the company, because the control of the company is all in the trust to be held into perpetuity. So stakeholders can come and go, but it doesn't affect the ongoing enterprise.
Right. And so rather than anybody having the incentive or anybody benefiting from a liquidity event or an exit, it really is, as Natalie, I think, called it earlier, kind of a pay-as-you-go, right? It is on an annual basis, profits, benefits are shared with the stakeholders. And this was one of the questions that came up here in the chat as well, is, well, how do we determine who gets how much or who gets what when? So we actually kind of baked in or predetermined what that cash waterfall, how cash would get distributed or how cash would get used in the investment documents in this case. So there is a kind of, this is sort of the 7-tier structure. The tier 1 is the ongoing operations of the company. So whatever the board determines is sort of a reasonable operating budget for the company, right? Typical operation and kind of ongoing investments. The second tier is debt service for, again, senior lenders. Then there is a third tier, which is operational reserve. So currently that's set at basically the cash that the cash reserves on the balance sheet, that's currently set at 3 months, and the board does have some discretion around changing that. And then tier 4 is where we come in as preferred equity investors, and we get our base dividend, which is a 5% cumulative dividend. After that dividend is paid out, if that dividend is paid out in full, we go to tier 5. Tier 5 is variable compensation, essentially bonuses to the workers, which is set at up to 20% of net income for the previous year. Next, tier number 6 is redemption requests. So we all envision this to be a long-term investment, but if investors do want to get out, this is where cash is used to honor a redemption request to buy out investors who want to get out. And then last tier 7 is upside. So anything left over after all these other uses of cash is distributed to amongst the 5 stakeholder groups. The 5 stakeholder groups are the investors, workers, growers, customers, and community allies, other community organizations. And there are some sort of qualifying criteria within each of those. So it's not necessarily all of the investors, and it's not necessarily all of the workers, and not necessarily all of the customers. There's some qualifying criteria like you would have in a co-op where not everybody's a member. And then we'll get into how that gets distributed, but there's also a formula for how those upside distributions get allocated amongst the various stakeholders. But essentially, it means that if the company has excess profits, the company is doing well, we are all kind of rising tide lifts all boats, right? Where we all do better. We might end up with, instead of a 5% dividend, maybe an 8%, maybe more. But if we're getting that upside participation, it means the other stakeholders benefit as well. So there's a couple of things to note here, maybe to highlight here. One is that so there's quite a bit of discretion here, right? I mean, you could, if you look at this as an investor, it's like, well, what if the board just decides to spend everything, reinvest everything, and go on an M&A spree, or invest a lot in CapEx, or just increase the operating reserves from 3 months to 5 months, and we never get anything, right? So that's one thing we spent quite a bit of time thinking about. So there's a couple of sort of mechanisms here. One is the fact that we, again, are kind of all in this together, right? So if all of the cash gets used in tier 1 or 2 or 3, it's not just us investors who might at some point wonder, hey, why aren't we getting distributions? It's everybody else, right? The workers aren't going to get their annual bonus, which they've come to expect over many years. Other stakeholders will probably kind of chime in as well. So there's some kind of built-in protection there. Also to note, the dividend is cumulative. So if it's skipped a certain year, then it has to be made up the following year, and which is different than some of these other preferred equity the structures we've seen in the past with co-ops I mentioned. And finally, there is this sort of governance kind of grievance mechanism if need be, right? Each of the stakeholders can file grievance with this enforcer, this trust enforcer body that can kind of oversee and intervene if they feel that the board is not making decisions that are aligned with the purpose of the trust. And also really interesting to note in that context, the purpose of the trust, I think Natalie mentioned, is first and foremost, the purpose of the trust is to promote sustainable, healthy food systems. But within that, within the trust documents, the purpose of the trust is also to engage stakeholders and to share the benefits of the business with its stakeholders. So that is also kind of part of what the board is accountable for. That's a lot there. I see there's just a question that came up here, which is that farmers aren't included in the coworker pool. That's correct. It's only in tier 5. So the variable compensation, unless I'm missing something here, Natalie, looks like you were going to chime in.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that farmers and employees benefit in tier 1. And then tier 5 is for employees, and then tier 7, farmers can additionally benefit. But the reinvestment in company operations, that's how, remember, getting back to our mission, the best way we can serve farmers is being a distributor that helps them get their product to market and sell their product, and work with them on crop coordination and the best pricing we can give them, and grower services that we offer, such as packaging discounts or certifications and infrastructure. So they benefit from our ability not having external shareholders that all the profits go out to. Instead, because of this balanced structure, we have more to reinvest operationally on a day-to-day basis with what we provide to farmers, and also employees there with their base compensation and progressive benefits. And then additionally, in tier 7, if we have excess profits, we can reinvest in expanded grower services on tier 1. Just so that's how farmers benefit.
Yeah, no, that's right, and that is one of the one of the questions that might come up is, well, why is the preferred investor return, why does it precede? Why is it in tier 4 versus the worker bonus in tier 5 and the other stakeholders in tier 7? So why do we come first? And I think it's exactly what Natalie just said. It's actually not first, right? Because the other stakeholders are essentially in tier 1, right? In tier 1 is OGC's sort of core operations and purpose, really, which includes paying farmers above market prices and paying workers above market wages and all of that, right? So that's kind of the base. The base participation for those other stakeholders, and then hence it kind of makes sense that the preferred equity dividend is in tier 4 kind of comes before any additional participation from these other stakeholders. And then this just gets into kind of this next slide is what that tier 7 looks like. So this is the how much of the upside distributions go to preferred equity investors. So so again, let's say there's $1 million left over after tier 1 to 6. There's still $1 million left over to be distributed amongst the 5 stakeholder groups. 40% of that will go to investors until investors hit a 7% return. And then once they hit a 7% return, if there's still more to be distributed at that point, only 20% of that upside goes to investors, with a balance 80% going to the other 4 stakeholder groups, which is a couple of things just to quickly to note here. One is, I think, kind of going back to some of the core transform finance principles around being non-extractive, or making sure that there's more value being created than being extracted. So in all cases here, investors are getting less than half of these upside distributions, and in many cases, the company is doing really well. The total share of profits that goes to investors is actually quite low. And in that last tier, it's not a coincidence that it's 20%. So we're essentially kind of envisioning it as being equally distributed in 5 parts, 20% to each of the 5 stakeholder groups. So I think we're close to wrapping here, and I just kind of pulling back here to the 30,000-foot level again in terms of the why, why all of this innovation, or why come up with something different in terms of the structure. And I think one of the questions we sometimes get is, well, doesn't benefit corporation really provide the kind of mission control and that you need and allow you to remain independent and kind of mission first? I think the way we would frame that is, essentially benefit corporations allow the board, give the board sort of permission to consider stakeholder impact beyond share price maximization in an exit scenario. So it does start to get into this concern around mission drift when a company is acquired, right? So theoretically, if you get one acquisition offer from a company that you think would gut your impact and fire everybody, and another acquisition offer from a more values aligned acquirer, but the values aligned acquirer is offering a lower share price with a benefit corporation, it empowers you to pick the lower valuation because you're considering impact beyond share value, whereas ordinarily you might be sued by your investors for not maximizing returns, right? So that's sort of the level, I think, of kind of protection that a benefit corporation offers, which is something. It is worth noting, though, that can be changed. Like a supermajority, I think ordinarily 2/3 of shareholders can approve a change, can approve any acquisition, can approve a change of purpose or structure. So so it is a level of protection or a level of independence that is given to the board, but it's certainly not airtight. And then if you think about the steward ownership principles that Derek laid out, so it really kind of goes a couple of steps further, right? So the company, there's a veto on being sold, so an exit is essentially sort of off the table. There's limits on profits going out of the business, and then the idea is that by removing those two things, by removing the desire, the need to exit, and by removing the ability to extract profits to shareholders, you're by design focusing you're shifting your focus in favor of other stakeholders, right? There's less pressure from one stakeholder, from investors. There's more that goes towards workers and other stakeholders, right? And then I think what we've done here with OGC is maybe even going kind of a step further in terms of really getting really specific around what that means and explicitly making the various stakeholder groups a part of a profit waterfall and a part of sort of a shared governance structure where we all have a voice in nominating governance bodies that oversee the trust. So I think hopefully that's helpful in sort of framing how this is different, or how a benefit corporation is sort of one step in that direction. And I think, as Natalie may have noted, OGC was already structured as a benefit corporation, right? So evidently they felt the need to kind of go a couple steps deeper there. I think that's that was, I believe, the final slides here. We can take some more questions, and or open it up back to the group here to talk about learnings and replicability. But I'm seeing there's a question. Stakeholders in Tier 7 group who aren't investors sharing profits in equal proportions. So yeah, again, there is so in terms of how the profits get shared amongst the various stakeholder groups in Tier 7, to be honest, some of that is still, the details of that will get ironed out. I mean, we had to kind of iron out our portion of that as investors to close the transaction, and firm up how much is going to be left over for the other stakeholder groups. There's a committee, the Trust Protector Committee, that will be putting together over time the more detailed policies and procedures around what each stakeholder groups, how they get compensated and how they get qualified. Again, there are some questions around. Is it the larger growers? Is it the smaller growers? Is it the growers that have been with the company for a very long time? But I will say, if the Trust Protector Committee sets qualifying criteria that are not in line with the purpose of the company, then I think we'll all going to question that, right? So, for example, if the qualifying criteria are only the largest growers, but that excludes the local growers, that would pretty clearly go against the purpose of sort of promoting a local food ecosystem, right? So that has to be accounted for in those qualifying criteria. Is that fair, Natalie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that the board and management has a lot of discretion on Tier 7 to listen to our stakeholder groups and take the proceeds and invest in things that will benefit those groups. So I think, for example, with advocacy, it's probably our donations into nonprofits working on organic and sustainable ag policy, community organizations that we interact with, so more of a donation basis with farmers, like I said, grower services that typically are more needed by small and mid-scale farmers because the large farmers have their own infrastructure. And for customers, we're envisioning things like, for example, if you could, maybe our customers have a certain number of qualified low-income people who regularly shop. Maybe it's a discount program to make our produce more affordable to those customers over time. So we're still designing what these programs look like. So some of it might be, I think for workers and investors, it's cash, but I think for the other stakeholder categories, it might be other forms of contribution and infrastructure that better serves them. So in terms of learnings and replicability, I just wanted to share that in our structure, we've been around for 40 years. And so we really looked at our whole end-to-end supply chain. Who are all the partners we need to make us successful every day? It's the farmers who put their product through us. It's the workers who work with us. It's our customers that support us, the ag landscape, and then also, or the advocacy landscape, as well as investors putting in capital. We're all contributing something to making this business successful. And now we're all motivated through our structure to keep the business viable, and then we all share in that success. But I think as a design principle, any business could look at, who are your end-to-end folks that make your business successful, and then select who do you want to share the returns and the governance with. And it might be, in our model, we have 5 groups. You could keep it a lot more simple and have it be 2 groups or 1 group. You can design a purpose trust to be a lot more simple in terms of your stakeholders, and even more simple, like I said, in terms of governance. You can simply have a leadership group that self-appoints versus having this process to have all of your stakeholders elect the leadership group. So I think it's a very flexible structure to design your purpose, to design that the company will be operated to design how you want the income shared and reinvested, and who you want to be the stewards at the trust level to ensure that it stays true to purpose.
I wanted to jump in just on the sort of final note of learnings and replicability. To the name that NARE has a great article coming out, and I think it's already out actually, in Impact Alpha, which talks about this in a lot of detail and also talks a little bit about some of the challenges and conversations that we had. This investment structure isn't perfect. I think it's important to be sort of like frank about that. There were challenges. There are things I think we can do better next time. But I guess zooming out a little bit for the Transform Finance community, there has been sort of this de facto standard, I feel like, that has come a little bit from the equal exchange model, that we see lots of companies kind of replicating that, and that has the sort of implications and challenges of what you were bringing up earlier. Is kind of looks like debt, it's like low return, it has no controlling stake, there's like limited protections, etc. And I think that part of the effort of why we put so much time and energy into making this really work for everybody is obviously we love the company and want to invest, but also we're trying to experiment with what is, as sort of Anair said about the Goldilocks structure, what would a new standard look like for us to create not just multi-stakeholder trusts specifically, but to create investment structures that are giving us explicit ways of including these other stakeholders, not just sort of both not totally disadvantaging investors, but also not leaving it sort of ambiguous and vague. So a part of our hope on the purpose side is also to share this information as widely as possible. If you want more information about it, then feel free to reach out to me, or I don't want to offer Anair's services, but you can definitely reach out to me, and I'm happy to have a call with you, debrief the detail, share documentation, etc.
Derek, before we jump, I wanted to make sure.
And I'll just add in along those lines, asking for help. So, as part of our larger mission at OGC, we believe you can't fix a broken system with a broken finance system, and we need to redesign new tools for us to use for mission-based social enterprises. And so we are available to help. We've got kind of a consulting arm we've launched, Organically Grown Consulting, and we're also partnering with Purpose on the nonprofit side to spread open source tools and learning. But I think that we can all get to redesigning better models faster by iterating as a community and supporting each other in these journeys. So
maybe
one question here, Anair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to make sure we pick up on Bruce's question here before we close. And if you can think of scenarios in which it would be important for the investors to retain the possibility of an exit, like to a larger company or to the public.
Yeah, I think looks like Derek just typed up something there, but I would say that it's that the possibility of an exit, the possibility of the trust selling the business, and jump in, Natalie, if you disagree, but it is not off the table. It's not precluded, right? And nothing precludes the trust from doing that. I think all we've done is taken away the profit motive to do that. So there is, I think, as we got into, if there is an exit, and let's say it's a very successful exit, would we or others get a windfall, right? And we intentionally took that off the table, right? And said, all right, well, if there are distributions, if there are further proceeds, it would go back to the trust. So the stakeholders don't have that incentive. There's no upside in it for us. So it just means that if there is hypothetically another super mission aligned or trust owned or some other steward owned entity that wants to acquire OGC from this purpose trust, that can be done, but the consideration, the decision will be based on promoting and furthering the mission.
Yeah, and our structure takes off the table anyone doing that for personal gain, because nobody would personally gain from that circumstance.
Great. And with that, I would like to take the last few minutes to thank you all for having this webinar with us. Extremely informative, lots of very interesting technical aspects to it. So I would encourage those in attendance to follow up with us or with Natalie, Anair, and Derek, again, without necessarily volunteering them for it. So thank you, Natalie Reitman-White of OGC, and Arben Ami of Candide Group, and Derek Razo of Purpose for joining us today. And for those of you on the line, if you're interested in the work of Transform Finance or the Transform Finance Investor Network, please get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to also do some follow-up conversations on some of the questions that were coming up and that we explored. So thank you all for a great, very informative webinar. The recording will be online soon. You can get in touch with us if you need it for your colleagues or otherwise. Thank you for joining us. Till the next time.
Thank you.